That's why it's only the American flag, by the way. I'm kind of telling people like, hey, I'm here because I care about you more so than I care about policing you.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. All right, so Peter Coffin, you are a YouTuber and a podcaster. The name of your podcast is, what is it?
Pact.
Pact. And that's, what does that stand for?
Well, P is for Peter, and ACD is what my partner goes by online. Miss Astronaut Cowboy Doctor is abbreviated as ACD.
So it's Pact. And you've been on YouTube for quite a long time.
Yes.
Doing a variety of different kinds of videos. You've become a part of what I'll call BreadTube, although that might be a dated term now. I'm not sure what it's called anymore.
Well, it still exists, but I would say most of that has all sort of moved towards Democrat tailism. It's kind of, I don't approve of that, obviously.
Yeah. When do you think that happened? Was it a Democrat tailism from the start, or?
See, that's an interesting question, because I think it probably varies in terms of each person who was involved in it. Like, I don't know what everybody else thought. Everybody kind of kept me at an arm's length. They were always suspicious of me because I think, of a slightly different affect, sort of a more worker sounding person. And I don't mean that in terms of like what I'm talking about. I mean that in terms of like, I am very obviously not an academic or somebody who's gone to university or things like that. It doesn't come across as though I am. And I think that they're of a sort of mindset where that's important, that's necessary. And I have never been of that mindset. So for me, going into what BreadTube was in the start, I was very genuine about what I was talking about. I care very much about not tailing the Democrats. I care very much about not landing at a class collaborative result. I'm not a fan of that. But I know. I think that when you subscribe to a kind of utopian program as opposed to a materialist program, ACD came up with this sort of dichotomy. If utopianism, you start either wanting socialism, and then you realize more and more that this ideal you put forward as the end point can't happen. So you either have to fork off with a sort of a nihilism or tailism, and that's pretty much. A lot of them, I think, went the tailism route, and then a lot of them went we see the post left nowadays. That's kind of the result of the nihilism route.
Well, I have kind of mixed feelings about utopianism. Marx was critical of the utopian socialists back in his day, but he also saw them as important and an example of progressive thought.
They had the right ideals. They put those ideals into action. It's just the more that you define exactly what the thing that you're going to end up with, the less you're going to be able to fulfill that promise. And ultimately, I think you end up with a lot of people who are like, well, this isn't what you said we were going to do, and we're not getting anywhere with it. Why is that? And you have to have a sort of materialist program to avoid that. You have to start from the contradictions and work from there, rather than start from an end point where everything looks like Star Trek and work towards that.
Right. I think the way I think about it is often enough people are critical of the utopian socialists because they are holding on to a status quo kind of unconsciously. There's
Yeah.
the criticism of the utopians is they're asking for too much. They're asking for too much of a transformation. Um, they don't understand the reality of our situation, whether the reality is the material basis being intractable or something about human nature.
Yeah.
It depends. Yeah,
That's my favorite one is when it starts to get about like what is in people's hearts. Can we get past that and get to socialism? It's
right,
like
right, yeah, yeah.
that is a fundamentally bad position to be coming from. You just can't win anybody over that way because you're basically telling them, "Well, I have a perfect idea as to what society should be, and
Mhm.
you, sir, are in my way."
Right. Well, why don't we come back to the question of utopianism? I tend to think like utopian socialist at times, although I try to do so from well within like
Mhm,
Marx's critique of political economy, so from a
mhm.
materialist perspective. But my utopian thinking would be, how do we transform production? What would be the necessary changes that the workers could implement to create a new foundation for society? But that is still aiming at a kind of concrete,
Yeah, I was
defined
gonna say
change.
that doesn't sound a whole lot like utopianism to me.
Right. Well, right, right. Well, it's not a whole lot like it, but but the hesitation for me is always that whatever changes to production I think the working class should implement might be I'm invariably going to be wrong, and
Well, yeah.
I'm invariably going to overlook something.
Ingalls was really right when he said the more um I don't remember what word he used, but the more like completely you outline the end game, the less you can fulfill it because you're not really paying attention to the contradictions. You're more paying attention to an image in your head of what is the ideal. And we can all have like capitalists have ideal imagery in their heads of what capitalism should look like, and that clearly doesn't happen. Like the idea that competition and the free market and all of these things are going to lead us to this magical point where everybody lives their best life, where they've all achieved, like we started a business and we did this thing and
Mhm.
we've accumulated wealth in a paradigm that doesn't allow for that. Um, it's a situation where I think like, and I also think, sorry to sort of shift here, I think that a lot of the time a lot of people look at utopianism as sort of a like all communism is utopianism, and I think that you have to end up having to make distinctions there that I think are very important, because a lot of people say, well, you want a classless society, well, that's a utopia. It's like, well, no, it's not a utopia. It's a very generalized thing. I can't tell you exactly what a classless society looks like. I haven't lived in one,
Mhm.
but the likes of Ben Shapiro will say, well, your utopian nonsense doesn't work.
Right, right, right. Well, okay, so okay, I want to come back to this utopian
Hmm.
question, but just to stick to your bio for a moment, when we first met, I mean, we met a couple of different ways. Like I reached out to you when I was starting Zero Books, or was
Hmm.
maybe into the Zero Books YouTube channel, and we
Hmm.
did some collaboration, and then we had a conflict on Twitter, as people do, about intersectionality, which ended up with us engaging in a struggle session that you didn't organize and which you felt went
That didn't go
off
well.
track. Off track. Yeah,
That
that
didn't
did
go
not
well
go
for
well.
either of us, I don't
No,
think.
no,
And
it
also,
didn't.
ultimately, I think we've both landed on basically the same position. I think a lot of it was how we were represented to each other by other people.
Hmm. Right. Well, I can pretty much peg you as a rad lib in that
Mhm.
moment. Like as someone
Fair.
who, yeah, yeah.
Like, again, that bread tube, that group very much ended up that. So, like, the fact that I was associated with that group, I think it's fair to make that assumption.
But
But,
did you? Well, my question was, do you think that you have moved
I
in your?
certainly have moved, but I think everybody does that.
Yeah, yeah. So, what I guess I'm interested to know is like what has led you to shift away from maybe embracing intersectionality, not because I don't disavow intersectionality in some contexts. Like
I
I
do at
think
this point.
I think intersectionality makes sense in courtroom settings or in legal battles and maybe even in some union battles. There's
I
times
think it
when
depends.
Mhm.
I really like, for me, when we're talking about that, I think intersectionality is kind of a framework that ultimately doesn't address the actual problem. It kind of directs people away from addressing the actual problem, and instead sort of inspires a difference-minded thing rather than a trying to get people towards an equality. Now, keep in mind, its stated goal is nothing of the sort, and that's, I would say, just in good faith, that was why I would ever personally accepted it, was like, hey, the stated goal here, like, we want to end racism, we want to end like discrimination. It's like, well, yeah, of course I want
Yeah.
that.
Well, but intersectionality, as I understand it, arose in a legal context around
Hmm.
who was hired first and who was first to be hired or last to be hired and first to be fired, and
Hmm.
whether or not a corporation could be sued for discrimination and violating civil rights of their workers. And
Liabilities.
yeah, so like in that context, which is a context which was not aimed at transforming society but just enforcing the law, labor laws, and
Hmm.
the rights under a bourgeois system,
Hmm.
the capitalist system, I would support intersectionality or an
Well, I mean,
intersectional
you
approach to
get
the
a
law.
form of standard going, at least, and it's hard for me to say, like, well, you know, do I think that, okay, so this is really my sort of problem with that. It's not necessarily that I think that that's fundamentally wrong. It's that I think that it doesn't even really accurately handle those situations. Like, I think that what it ultimately implicates is, like, I'm writing a book right now called Woke Ouroboros, and how it's that type of thinking, it dichotomizes and categorizes in ways that it might say that it's fighting essentialism or segregation, but ultimately, like, the result has been both of those things. I think that
Mhm,
a lot
mhm,
of what intersectionality does, it creates these sort of ideological justifications for what maybe 40 years ago we would say is essentialism. We would say, like, well, I personally don't think that there's anything fundamentally different about a black person and a white person, for instance. Um, and somebody who subscribes to a lot of intersectional thought might also say, like, agree with that, but then delineate a bunch of ideas that sort of place black people into a totally different paradigm, in which, like, their thoughts operate completely differently. And I would say that, I mean, sure, there's different experiences, but they don't create a fundamentally different experience. It's more of a disparity than a
yeah, I heard from, well, one of my kids was seeing a therapist and
mhm,
was arguing that about how a certain concept wasn't rational. It
mhm,
was, I don't even remember what it was. It had something to do with gender ideology.
mhm.
And the therapist said back to him, "Oh, you've got to understand that, rationality, logic, reason, those are very white ideas and white
Oof.
ideals." And there are
That's
people of
racist.
different,
Like, that's outwardly racist. Like, that's
right.
saying that black people aren't rational, which is no.
It wasn't just black people, but any
Well,
non-white,
yeah,
I
people
suppose,
of
right?
color, I would
Right.
imagine probably some other cultural minorities as well.
Mhm.
But, like, that's exactly what I'm talking about. It
But that
creates an
was a
ideological.
hyper woke thing to say.
Mhm.
That was meant to be a progressive, inclusive, and
Exactly. But what
intersectional.
does that justify? Like, what ideologically could that possibly justify? Like, why would you want people to think of, like, rationality in that way? Like, sure, there's definitely a mode of thinking that I think is worth talking about, that's ideologically, quote unquote, Western.
Mhm,
And I think that that's definitely worth examining. But it's
mhm,
also like, that is more the bourgeois side of the ideology. That's the ruling ideology that would be, sort of disseminated by the ruling class, like,
mhm,
the
mhm,
German ideology says, for instance.
mhm, mhm.
Um, that is, I mean, that would be what I would want to tackle, whether or not you called it the bourgeois ideology or what have you. I think that intersectionality ultimately does so much in removing those class distinctions and makes it so that like that type of ideology, which I think is very much worth discussing, just becomes white. And it's not necessarily about who owns and who rules or who has control. It's just like, well, white people think this way. So it's good when black people aren't rational because that's essentially what black people are. I like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? It kind of justifies the same kind of thinking that racists had a full century ago. But it gives it to us in a way that is plausibly, deniably not about the fundamental essence of the person, despite the fact that somehow it comes back to that in terms of like core thinking, in my opinion, anyways.
Yeah. I mean, the main thing that approach does to politics is cut off thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, it's
Thought
like
terminating,
terminating thought. It's a thought termination because, if once you say to someone, "Well, we're no longer in the terrain of reason. Reason itself is racist," then, what's left? Authority. It's basically whoever has political authority or power in that moment. Right.
exactly.
That
Yeah,
just means
it's
that's
a
basically saying
perfect
just accept.
justification.
Yeah, just accept what we say. That's
Yeah, accept what
doesn't
we
matter.
say. The
Mm.
position you're in currently is the position you're supposed to be in. Know your place. Don't get in other people's way. And then the other thing is like you see like a lot of people who preach for an intersectional ideology,
Mhm.
whether or not they ultimately kind of really just want proper representation of various groups in the bourgeoisie. Like,
Mhm.
for instance, if you had 13% black bourgeoisie and 4.1% of the bourgeoisie was trans, they might say to you, well, this is equality, you see. And it's
Mhm.
like, I don't and if you described it back to them in those stark of terms, I feel like they'd probably say, no, that's not what we're saying. But then when you take what they're actually saying, that seems to be the result that they're seeking. You
So
know,
back to our struggle session, because I don't know if we've talked about this on a podcast before. I
I
think
don't
we
think
probably
so.
have. Maybe we haven't. What do you think happened there? What went wrong? How did that end up being such a clusterfuck?
Well, the struggle session was originally about the supposed differences you and I had. And a lot more people were added who had completely different ideas about all of it. Like for me, when I heard people talking about like how, I guess the best way to put it is, because I am of this identity, I know literally everything about this thing. So anything you have to say, it's worthless here. And it's like, well, I'm not really trying to talk about your personal life or your
Mhm.
personal like behaviors or interactions with other people, because I'd probably be quite supportive of any disparaging stuff there. But I think that event, the way that it kind of went down that track, and how there wasn't really any real moderation, there wasn't really any goal other than I think kind of to make it so that I don't know, because the
See, what
organized,
happened was it was supposed to be you and I talking,
yeah.
and then someone caught wind that we were going to be talking about intersectionality in the conference, and it was the
Oh,
two of us, two white guys,
the
going to be
whites.
talking. Two white guys doing that, and then, but more importantly than white, it was guys, right? I mean, I know you're they now.
Yeah,
Right,
well,
right.
I, I
Yeah,
am an any. That's the way I look at that. I think
yeah.
that like
But
imposing things on other
the
people isn't cool.
yeah, perception was two white guys, right? And
Yeah,
then
and it
so
would
then
still
they
be.
yeah, right. So then they uh decided, okay, well, we need to get some people of color on this panel, and we need to get some women on this panel, and
Mhm.
we hopefully need to get some trans people on the panel. And they managed to do all of that in pretty short order. The people on the panel were people of color, from or women, or mostly both. I think it was like you and I were the two guys. No, and Derek Farn.
Yeah, Derek, who was also confusing. I think that he was really trying to mediate between the two.
Right. He it's I at the end of it I said, "Et tu, Brutus?"
He was really, I felt like he was really trying to like synthesize, and like maybe we weren't really thinking about it at the time, but like I understand that instinct. I think that it's the wrong instinct.
Well, anyway, I came out of that struggle session pretty irritated with everybody there, and feeling like all of my misgivings about a certain part of the left had been confirmed.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't feel like I was changed much. Like I didn't walk away going, "Oh, now I'm even more or I'm less,"
It was
anything.
confirmation, more or
Yeah, it
less.
was a confirmation. And but was that an eye-opening experience for you to
It
be part of?
much was when that happened to me. It was I was just kind of like, well, ostensibly, I should have been on your side here, and you basically just wanted to talk over me and stop me from speaking. And it's like, isn't that like kind of, and that's like the inkling that you have. Like I didn't really, I'll say I didn't really intensely study intersectionality back in 20, when was that? 2018.
Yeah. Mhm. It was a
I
while
hadn't
ago now,
really,
huh? 4 years ago already.
yeah, I hadn't really, like I'd read probably Crenshaw's original essay, which says a lot of things in it that I think her original essay is very much more open-ended than what intersectionality eventually
It's
became.
more humble. I think one
Yes,
of the things Crenshaw, I think, if I remember correctly, Crenshaw said was this is not meant to be a theory of society. It's not,
correct.
it,
She did.
yeah.
She absolutely did. Like
Mhm.
she's very clear that it's meant in a very specific legal context.
Yeah.
And I think that ultimately, like within that very clear context, it makes some sense to advocate at least some of the analysis there. I don't necessarily think that
You're
the
you're already given this context where
Mhm,
protected categories exist under the law.
mhm,
Okay. And the question is, should the combination of these protected categories be considered a third category
mhm,
rather than taken separately? So, in
mhm,
the context of a company being sued for discrimination because they let go of people of color, but particularly women of color, the
mhm,
question can't be answered by saying no. We didn't target women and we didn't target people of color. You
mhm.
have to ask, did you target women of color?
Well,
And
yeah,
you're right, and
exactly.
that's that intersection of both those categories, and it makes sense in
I
that.
agree
Yeah.
very much
Mhm.
because it does like, and the thing is, like within that context, again, you're talking about the experience of its own specific demographic, like within, because again, the experiences of a woman and the experiences of a black man, for instance, are very different things.
Yeah, in the
In
context of that company, they worked in different parts of the company. Like
Mhm,
the black men who had been hired were working like in the warehouse, and the
exactly.
black women who were hired were part of the secretarial pool. And they didn't. So they would say, "No, look, we have plenty of people of color. They're all down there in the warehouse."
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. I
um,
believe that was the exact example she used.
yeah.
It
Hmm.
was, I forgive me for not being able to remember the exact company, but there was a very
I can't
large,
either.
I mean,
Yeah.
it was written in the midst of a specific lawsuit, and I think that, like, it's very applicable to that. Like, it works from that point. And again, like you said, it's a much more sort of humble paper. And from there, what has been extrapolated out has been such a, basically the entire theory of political change, the theory of political analysis, it's all sprung forth from that. And I just,
The problem is that you move these legal categories, these legally protected categories, from the realm of law into the
Mhm,
realm of identity and even more like social structure. So they talk about structural racism, things like
mhm,
that. So now you're saying these legally protected categories are ex- have an explanatory can explain how people behave in a variety of contexts and who they are in an
mhm.
overall cultural system, which
Yes.
is I think an extraordinary thing to claim, and
Yeah.
and has not and has not been adequately argued for. But
then
okay,
also as a
go ahead.
also as a means of building power, to use a framework which is specifically intended to delineate very specific groups, like for instance to say the experience that a Black woman has is different than that of women and different than that of men. That's an inherently separating prospect, and when we're trying to build political power and exert will upon a structure that is hostile, you need to not separate people. You need to bring people together. So it's sort of a fundamentally like it's a flawed reasoning that you would, I mean, yes, of course, everybody wants to stop racism and everybody wants to stop bigotry. These aren't good things. Hold on.
I've had 4 kids, and I remember my 2 sons, my oldest and my middle son, both let their hair grow long. And when they were about that age and a little older, and everyone would always say, "How are you today, little girl?" And things like that. And it never bothered either of them. They're like, whatever. They think I'm a girl, I'm a boy. Doesn't make any difference to me. Yeah. So that age, they really didn't have a lot of identification with gender anyway. They were, I don't know what they were identified with. Red cars and backhoes and train engineers. And
it's an unending list of new things, actually.
Princesses and ducks and whatever. All right, so okay, back to away from intersectionality. We could stay on intersectionality for this whole conversation if we let ourselves. But I want to ask you, like, so after that struggle session, you became a little more critical of maybe some of the doctrines that were commonly accepted in the milieu of RedTube or the left that you were dealing with, perhaps?
Well, I'll say this. In 2015, this goes back a little bit further, there was this letter written called "We Are the Left" that was against the Bernie left, which I would say since about 2015 to about this, I would say I was in the Bernie left, which my sort of tacit, like, I think that intersectionality seems perfectly fine because it's about getting rid of bigotry. It came from that because, like, I had read some, small amounts of Marx. I had read by 2018, I'd read Capital, to be honest, but I didn't really read, I think, enough about intersectionality, unfortunately. And this type of thing made me think, well, the result of this is very clearly different than what I've wanted. And it reminds me of this "We Are the Left" letter. I don't know did you ever see that?
No, tell me who wrote it. Was it like hardcore Marxists writing it, or was it like Hillary Clinton supporting?
It was people who were, it was liberals, like people you would classify as SJWs, claiming like, no, we're the left. It was your anti-Gamergate people. It was your so on and so forth. And ultimately, like, when you look back on it, I think the who is most left, who has the most left points, is such a futile and ridiculous argument. When nobody is using any kind of material distinction to say any, they're just basing everything off of ideals. But like, it was sort of like that group of people, the sort of SJW, like, reaction to Gamergate, that had sort of grown out of the liberal side of the skeptic movement. They were sensing, I feel like, kind of a threat in the Bernie movement, and they wrote this letter. It's still on the internet if you look for it. It's called "We Are the Left," and it's about how intersectionality is something that the Bernie movement hates, and it's evil, and all of them are secretly bigots, and it's kind of a precursor to a lot of the ridiculous stuff that we saw about the Bernie Sanders people. And at this point, I can say that I'm pretty critical of Bernie Sanders himself, but there's a reason why that resonated with a lot of people. And these folks were basically attempting to sort of stop that, I guess. Like, no. Anti-bigotry is the only way forward. And it's like, well, I mean, if you really care about class, you kind of have to care about the ideological justifications for it, and bigotry is one of those. But that was kind of where I came from on it. Like, sure, like this stuff, I get what you care about. I also care about that stuff. I don't get why you think I don't. And then when we got to this struggle session and what happened there with all of this sort of, hey, everything that you say, I'm going to interrupt and you're not going to speak at all. And I'm going to say something that is do you remember? I don't remember what the story was about, but do you remember the story that the one woman told about
It's an Israeli
I
professor
think
who,
cooking?
yeah, she's like, I know what capitalism is when I go home and bake myself brownies and, and think about the discrimination I face every day or something like that.
I wanted to interrupt that so badly and just be like, what are you talking about? I don't understand this. Like, I don't understand where you're coming from. Like I said, I was familiar. I was familiar with the sort of Marxian analysis of the commodity, of a few other things. You don't just read Capital and understand it. It takes a while.
Yeah.
I've had to go back and, do research on it and things like that.
Mhm.
But, I had a basic understanding of some of these things. And when she started saying, I understand capitalism when I bake my bread, and I'm like, I like that just sort of melted my brain. And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. What are you talking? Like, please explain something material here. Like, what is capitalism to you? And then it starts being that question of what things are to you. And then when you start thinking about the fact that everything becomes that question, like, what is this to you? That's where everything starts breaking down, because you can't build a coherent movement against, whatever, if everybody is defining everything differently, which I feel like that was really when that landed hard for me, that event.
Yeah.
And then
They kept cutting you off, and they didn't cut me off though. They would let me talk.
well, they wanted you to say something dumb.
Right.
Like, you were the person who was ostensibly not intersectional, right?
Right.
And so they really just wanted you. I think they probably wanted to give you the rope to hang yourself with, so to speak, which is just saying something that isn't approved. It's not even necessarily saying something dumb, but
I think I managed not to do that for the most part.
I also think you managed not to do that, much to their chagrin.
Right. I mean, yeah, it was an interesting thing. I don't think that I redeemed myself in anyone's eyes, but it was. I don't know exactly all that was going on in the background of that convention, but it certainly it was a moment that I kept wanting to put into a short story or a novel or something.
Mm-hmm.
Like, have this be either a major catalyst for the main character at the beginning, or be the culmination of something at the end as a struggle session. But it was just one moment, and since then you have gone what I would say would be into people who are critical of you would say you've become anti-woke. This is what I hear from people about. So, Peter Coffin, you ruined him. He became anti-woke.
Well, I'm certainly not pro woke. I would say that. Like, I think that wokeness is it's kind of a commodified state of mind. I think it's kind of a commodified state of mind in which you kind of just get to feel superior. Like I said, I'm writing a book about it, and I've gone through the sort of history of it. Like, if you go back to Lincoln's presidential campaign, you can find this organization called the Wide Awakes, which is they're these people who their eyes were opened. They became woke about slavery, and they sort of operated as an unintentional BLM, where BLM, I think, was pretty obviously subsumed by the Democrat campaign apparatus over the course of 2020. But it kind of worked in that same way without the Democrats subsuming it. It just kind of like, they were like, all right, Lincoln, he is pro-abolition of slavery, therefore we are pro-Lincoln. And they would do marches, and they would do a lot of these things. And it's interesting to me because I think that it was a lot more like more specifically struggle oriented. I feel like they really did work like hard at what they were doing. They just show up and like say, "It's great to do this thing." They didn't hold up signs at Biden rallies that said, various slogans that don't really do anything. Defund the
Biden
police.
was around then, though, right? He was.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, that was when Biden got his start, and he was staunchly anti-abolition. He was still talking that way up to the 70s.
No joke, folks. Let's.
I don't want my kids growing up in a racial jungle, he said in 1967, I think.
Wow. So, God. And then nowadays, the last thing he said around those lines was, if you're not voting for me, you aren't black.
Which, I mean, that's an example of what I'm calling a woke Ouroboros. Like you come around like in the pro-capital political spectrum, like what people love to call the horseshoe theory. You eventually come around to a woke justification for saying something racist ultimately. Like,
right.
I feel like that's the spot that we're in. Like, of course I am, like for the stated purposes of wokeness, I would say that I'm not anti-woke at all. I would say that the stated purposes of wokeness are great. And I think that we should not have racism. It's just, I don't think that racism is really best fought on an interpersonal level. I think it's best fought through understanding disparities and, ultimately historical positions and demographic clustering, that type of stuff, like redlining. Those things actually represent like a historical sequence of events that leads us to where we are now, that if we actually start operating on those lines, we might be able to solve some of the things. I think that the interpersonal racism comes as a consequence of those things more so than I agree people with have hate in their hearts.
Right. I agree with you. So the content that you've been creating, though, has shifted a little bit in tone over the years, and you've decided that you're a patriotic socialist, and this may be where I become the woke scold about this, because I'm an international. I consider myself to be an internationalist.
I also consider myself to be an internationalist, though.
Okay, so what does it mean to you then to be a patriotic socialist?
When you said you wanted to talk to me about this, I brought up a Lenin quote that I love, that I think explains where I'm coming from on this. This is Lenin on the national pride of the Great Russians. Is a sense of national pride alien to us, the Great Russian class-conscious proletarians? Certainly not. We love our language and our country, and we're doing our very utmost to raise her toiling masses, i.e. 9/10 of her population, to a level of democratic and socialist consciousness. To us, it is most painful to see and feel the outrages, the oppression, the humiliation our fair country suffers at the hands of the czars, butchers, nobles, and capitalists. We take pride in the resistance of those outrages put up from our midst, from the Great Russians, in that midst. And then he goes into a bunch of names that I am not going to be able to pronounce. I'm not even going to try that. But he says then, we're full of a sense of national pride, and for that very reason, we particularly hate our slavish past, when the landed nobility led the peasants into war to stifle the freedom of Hungary, Poland, Persia, and China, and our slavish present, when these self-same landed proprietors, aided by the capitalists, are loading us into a war in order to throttle Poland and the Ukraine, which you can't say "the" in front of anymore. But it's more or less like he ends up talking. I mean, it's not right after this quote, but later in the essay, he talks about how Marx and Engels were the great teachers of the proletariat, and to understand that to actually free your proletariat, the proletariat of your nation, you have to understand that they existed. And this is my words, not Lenin's, but I believe this is what Lenin is saying. You have to understand your proletariat as a constituency of the international proletariat. And if the international proletariat is oppressed or exploited, then the national for lack of a better term, the local or domestic proletariat is not truly free. It's just privileged temporarily. My belief is that I don't love the U.S. state. I don't want the U.S. state to do any of what it does. I don't think that it's good for us. I don't think that it's good for the international proletariat. That said, in terms of like Pan-American solidarity, I am very for the people of the United States of America. I love the place that I'm from. I love the people around me. And I love the location. I love everything but the state, the mechanism that upholds class society.
Right. I guess the word patriotism is what I'm tripping up over.
A lot of people do. Michael Peretti actually, he dichotomized a couple of types of patriotism. He regarded the true patriotism and the sort of super patriotism, which is, I don't do it in. Obviously, you said proletarian patriotism. That is how I dichotomize it. Like the real patriotism would be the patriotism for the proletariat, raising 9/10 of her toiling masses, as Lenin said of Russia.
Right.
Whereas the super, sorry,
okay, go ahead. You go ahead.
Whereas the super patriotism is more of like a jingoistic bourgeois ideology, which is sort of, for all intents and purposes, forced upon everybody else. And a lot of people who are not in the bourgeoisie do accept that ideology. And I think that is where this particular difficulty comes from, because you can have somebody who is very obviously a proletarian who thinks that the U.S. state is great, who thought that we should go to should have done the Iraq War, should have done imperialism, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm for that person, for their autonomy, for their going against the bourgeoisie, which they might not even be for, but it's ultimately, it's a resistance against the state, because the country I live in is filled with people that this state is enforcing a class society onto.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's similar to loving your family or the family.
Absolutely.
Right. Like on the one hand, privileging your own family as above the society or community that you're in, or the needs of the world, that can lead to the kind of a family that you see in the television show Succession. Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Right.
I saw where you're going with that.
Right. But a mob family. On the other,
yes, absolutely.
Right. On the other hand, if you don't start with the love of your own family and the people who are closest to you, then how are you going to be able to build solidarity?
Well, exactly.
With people that you don't, that are not your family. You have to have a foundation of support.
Or even people in your family that don't understand where you're coming from. Like if I say I'm a communist, there are a lot of people in my family that are like, what are you talking about?
Right. And okay, so right, that's like finding the mutual interest based on family connection that will overcome those ideological differences actually is important for socialists to be able to
absolutely
do. Because we're going to be calling upon mutual interests amongst working people who may have very different ideologies as well, and they have to think of themselves as part of a class together, despite differences of opinion about politics or religion or who's a better football team or whatever. That's going to be important to build. I tend to think of myself as anti-American rather than patriotic. It's like I don't like when anti-Americanism pretends to be socialism or pretends to be leftist,
ultra leftism, more or less.
Right. Like
I completely agree.
Yeah. So like I tend to think that, like, you can like Americans, you can like American culture or aspects of it. You can find what's best in the American tradition. You should start to recognize that as unfinished as it is. The American nation was founded on revolution,
Well, it
and
was at very least like we can. I think there's a lot of nuance because I'm not necessarily for the unlimited veneration of the founding fathers, but like when you ultimately bring down to it, they were fighting against the British Empire for unjust taxation without representation, which is,
Mhm.
as far as I'm concerned, even though like the class society developed along the lines of some very unfortunate events after the revolution. The revolution, I think, was fought on legitimate pretenses, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, and it was part of a process of global revolution of the bourgeoisie in general.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually early in the struggle. We're like the first democratic republic in the world, the
Mm-hmm.
United States. We're a young country, but we're actually a pretty old nation, and
Absolutely.
and a pretty old bourgeois democratic state. So, yeah, I mean, I tend to think that there's a lot to love about America,
Mm-hmm.
even though almost everything I've done on as a leftist has been in opposition to what the state has done and what the government, is imposing and what the political class is doing. Like, I nonetheless feel like that is, that doesn't make me anti-American. It just makes me, uh,
It
uh,
makes you anti-bourgeoisie.
yeah, right. Makes me anti-bourgeoisie
And
and
that is exactly why,
anti-capitalist.
yeah, that's why we use the term proletarian patriot. It's not patriotism for the U.S. state, although a lot of people will say, like, you have an American flag, so that means you want the state to exist. And it's like, well, no, I've kind of said the opposite of that a lot of times.
But there are some things that get attached to patriotic socialism or proletarian patriotism, things like closed borders,
Mm-hmm.
or the idea that there can be socialism in one country, and maybe sometimes it seems to weirdly that the American proletarian patriots are fans of the Chinese government.
I don't
And
actually hate the Chinese government personally.
yeah, you
Yeah, I
don't.
think
Well,
that that's a long debate to have, though,
yeah, right. I don't
and it's a
hate. I don't.
nuanced debate to have.
I just don't think that the Chinese government is any kind of model for socialism. But
Well, it's again, it's there's a lot to be said that as far as I'm concerned, I'm not really what I would call pro-market in any way. So if I have any critique for China, it's the introduction of markets as opposed to planning. I understand their thinking as to why they introduced markets. They thought it would develop productive forces faster, but it's not what I would do. But
yeah,
also, it's a socialist project that is propagandized heavily by the U.S. state, and I think that that's worth supporting over the U.S. state.
okay. So you're no patriot at all, Peter Coffin.
it's almost it's almost like people misrepresent what we're about.
Well, you should take that American flag off your chest and put on the Chinese Communist Party flag.
Well,
How
I'd be
dare you?
I'd be I'd be a lot more. I'd probably be more adept at putting just the old USSR one, personally.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
All right.
people. That's why it's only the American flag, by the way. I'm kind of telling people like, hey, I'm here because I care about you more so than I care about um, policing you. And that's the thing that I think that a lot of people on the left, I try to dichotomize communism as something not of the left right political structure,
Mhm.
just because I think that sort of lends towards um, allowing a lot of anti-communist thought into what we would say as the left. And I think that, yes, it's very important to have a diversity of thought, but I think explicitly anti-communist thought is not helpful. Especially if we're trying to do any kind of class anything. Like as much as I think that like a lot of conservatives and things like that will have anti-communist thoughts, you can also, I have talked to more conservatives than I think at this point I can count, and gotten them to say, well, actually, that makes sense. Whether it's about nuclear power or it's talking about central planning or talking about like various things. Like, I mean, there's a fantastic book, although I think that it does have a few flaws. The central idea of it, The People's Republic of Walmart. I don't know if you've ever read that.
Yeah, Lee Phillips wrote that, right?
Yeah, it's a great book. Like he makes a case that Walmart, Amazon, these types of giants sort of, and I agree with this. This is something that if you especially pay attention to the supply chain issues that are going on now, I think sort of a lot of what he says in that book is borne out. They're sort of sub economies that are planned by the companies. Logistics is sort of code for having a planned sub economy. And that stuff works way better than competition. Sears, as opposed to Walmart and Amazon, ran on like basically an internal market system, and you've seen what happened to Sears. But I mean, that's kind of, this is the ADHD talking. Forgive me for that.
No, it's all right. That's okay. No, I need to have you back on, and we should talk about our differences in terms of economics and understanding of like the dominance of the market, or how significant being anti-market is. I mean, I obviously don't think that production should be done with the primary or exclusive aim of exchange in the market. I mean, that is what is capitalism is, right? Is the
Absolutely.
production of commodities for exchange primarily. And so on the other hand, I think that I think you can still have a capitalist base of society with a incredibly restricted market and state managed market. And that what that will do is create it will create distortions and difficulties, but none that wouldn't be created without it. Like the market itself creates like perfect. Like one of the things about reading Capital is that Marx puts forward a model where everything is working perfectly, where the market manages everything, and everything is exchanged as equivalents, and there's no corruption, and
the theory.
Right. This is the perfect theory of capitalism is put to the test, and it's found that there are inherent contradictions, that the profit declines, that it relies upon a class of exploited workers, and so on and so forth, right? And so what I hold with like this one of many state capitalist theories of the Soviet Union, which looked at the Soviet Union as essentially continuing the capitalist form, even though the market didn't dominate the economy, or even though the market was mediated through the state. And CLR James and Raya Dostoevskaya, and I think Grace Lee Boggs created what's called the Johnson Forrest tendency, or the Forrest Johnson tendency. I forget which order it comes in, but I essentially agree with their state capitalist theory. Now, I say that instead of arguing the specifics of Chinese policy or the state or the history of the Soviet Union. And, that's lazy on my part. It's easy. I've memorized, a tendency to point too vaguely, but nonetheless, that's what I would do.
Well, and also, like, if we're going to talk about that, both of us, I think, would need to get into a lot of that so that
we'd have to prepare.
Yeah. It's
right.
It's something that I am that I have found that like almost none of the like BreadTube type streamers or even a lot of the personalities, they just don't do it. Like their preparation is just like, I'm going to look at Wikipedia, and I can't believe that. Like I don't know how associated with BreadTube Destiny is at this point, but I was at an event called Better Discourse in Fort Worth a couple of months ago, and the subject of debate was Section 230 and whether or not social media companies should be regarded as platforms or publishers. And his response was, it doesn't even talk about that in the law. The law is 27 words. And yes, if you go to Wikipedia, the amount of the law that is quoted is 27 words. But the law is 4 pages long.
Right.
And it does talk about those things. Like, it doesn't in that specific 27 word quote that is the only thing that he read about it. But like, that is the mode that these people exist in. And while I can articulate some very generalized criticisms of what I like, what I don't like about my understanding of China, I would certainly have to do preparation to get into a real discussion on that.
Right. So, listen, I'm gonna, there's 2 ways for me to go about the next part. I could end this stream and start a second one. That would be for the patrons only, which I'm tempted to do. Would that be cool with you? I could go.
I'd be fine with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to end this stream here. But in the second stream, I want to just talk to you about being on YouTube, your aims as a media person.
Sure.
And what you think might be in the background pushing us content creators around. Because I don't feel like, as much as we feel as though we're moving and developing in our own free will, I also feel like we're being shoved around ideologically by
we're getting into my book here. So we'll talk about my book, Custom Reality, and you maybe a little bit of the new one, Cancel Culture, Mob Justice, or a Society of Subscription.
Okay, yeah. We'll talk about those things.
This is stuff that it's the juicy stuff.
Yeah, this is the stuff for the patrons, and we'll talk about that in the prayer room.